scent of moon blossoms was a lie. It spoke of joy, of sacred bonds and new beginnings. But to Isolde, it was the cloying fragrance of a tomb. Hidden in the deepest shadows of the Silverwood Pack's great hall, she was a ghost at her own funeral, forced to watch the man who was once her everything pledge his soul to another. The air, thick with the musk of 100 wolves celebrating, felt thin in her lungs. Every whisper was a phantom claw scraping against her skin. Every laugh a stone cast at the curse-born Omega who was never, and would never be, enough. She was a flaw in the tapestry, a broken thread the Alpha insisted on displaying as a warning. The weight of the moon pressed down through the high, arched windows, bathing the altar in a silver light that felt mocking and cruel. It illuminated him, Rhys, her fated mate. His shoulders were broad and strong under the ceremonial furs, his profile sharp and proud as he gazed down at his chosen bride. He was everything a beta should be: loyal, powerful, the future anchor of the pack. And he was beautiful, so painfully beautiful that looking at him felt like staring into the sun. Isolde's heart, a hollowed-out thing in her chest, gave a useless, aching throb. Her gaze drifted to the woman beside him. Lyra, golden-haired, with a wolf that ran strong and fast, from a lineage of warriors. She was perfect. She was whole. Everything Isolde was not. Isolde's hands trembled, and she clenched them in the rough fabric of her tunic, a shapeless garment meant to make her disappear. But she couldn't disappear. Alpha Valerius had made sure of that. "You will stand witness," he had commanded, his voice laced with the cold authority that had broken her. "You will see what the pack requires. You will understand what you cost us." What she cost them was strength. An Omega born without a voice and, as they'd discovered on her first shift, without a wolf to call her own. She was a void, a curse. The bond that had flared to life between her and Rhys on their 18th birthdays had been deemed a mistake by the fates, a cosmic error that the Alpha, with the Elder's blessing, had ritually severed. They had sliced it from the world, leaving behind a phantom limb that ached with every beat of his heart she could no longer feel. Now, she was just Isolde Renard, the silent Omega, the pack's cautionary tale, a splinter under its collective nail. The Elder's voice droned on, weaving the ancient words of the pledging rite. Each syllable was a hammer blow against Isolde's fragile composure. She focused on the cold stone floor beneath her worn boots, on the draft that snaked in from the corridor. Anything to ground her. She could feel the stares, the pity from the older females, the undisguised contempt from the pack warriors who saw her as a weakness Rhys had thankfully shed. They believed her silence was a stubborn refusal, an insult. They couldn't understand that the mechanism for speech had been broken in her since birth, a lock with no key. Her thoughts were a raging, screaming torrent trapped behind a dam of useless flesh. "Do you, Rhys of Silverwood, take Lyra of the Stonefall line, to be your mate, your anchor, and your Luna?" The Elder asked, his voice echoing in the sudden reverent hush. Isolde's head snapped up against her will. She saw Rhys turn to Lyra, his expression softening into a look of adoration that he had once, for a fleeting, wondrous month, aimed only at her. It was a look that promised protection, devotion, a lifetime. "I do," Rhys's voice rang out, deep and certain. It was the same voice that had once whispered her name in the darkness, telling her it didn't matter that she couldn't speak, that he would be her voice. He had lied. "And do you, Lyra of Stonefall, take Rhys of Silverwood, to be your mate, your strength, and your Alpha's right hand?" Lyra's smile was radiant. "I do." A wave of polite, joyous murmurs rippled through the pack. It was done. All that remained was the mark, the final, indelible seal that would overwrite the ghost of Isolde's claim on his soul forever. The Elder presented a small silver basin. Rhys dipped his fingers into the sacred oil within, his gaze fixed on the pale, perfect skin of Lyra's neck. He leaned in, his canines lengthening, gleaming white in the moonlight. Isolde's breath hitched. A silent scream built in her throat, a pressure so immense she thought her bones would crack. This was it. The final severing. The moment she would truly become nothing. She shut her eyes, a single, hot tear finally escaping, tracing a path of fire down her cold cheek. Let it be over. Let the pain end. Boom. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical concussion that shook the very foundations of the hall. The great oak doors, bound with iron, burst inward as if struck by lightning, slamming against the stone walls with a deafening crack. A primal wind, smelling of ozone, ancient pines, and blood, tore through the room. It extinguished every candle, plunging the hall into a disorienting chaos of moonlight and deep shadow. Gasps and startled cries erupted, but they were instantly choked off by a presence that flooded the space. It was an aura of absolute, suffocating power, a weight so immense it buckled the knees and stole the air from every lung. The pack's formidable alpha, Valerius, instinctively bowed his head, his body trembling in a display of submission so profound it was terrifying. Every wolf in the room, from the strongest warrior to the smallest pup, was flattened by it. A figure stood silhouetted in the ruined doorway, a man so large he seemed to consume the moonlight behind him. He moved with a predator's deliberate grace, his heavy boots echoing on the flagstones with the finality of a death knell. As he stepped into a shaft of moonlight, the pack's collective breath caught. King Corvin Drain, the Wolf King of the North, a figure of terrifying legend, a ruler forged in the brutal wars of the fractured territories. Whispers said his wolf was a monster, a throwback to the days of primordials. They said he'd clawed his way to the throne over the bodies of his own kin. Scars marred his face, a testament to a life of violence, the most prominent a silver line that cut across his left eye, rendering it a blind, milky orb. But his right eye burned with molten amber, a sliver of the feral sun. Silence, utter, terrified silence. Even the crackling of the central hearth seemed to have died. King Corvin's gaze swept over the hall, dismissing the cowering alpha, the stunned elder, the frozen couple at the altar as if they were nothing more than furniture. His stare was a physical thing, a hunter's survey of its domain. And then, it stopped. It stopped on her. Isolde froze, trapped in the suffocating intensity of his gaze. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking through her, stripping away the shadows, the shame, the silence, and seeing the raw, terrified thing huddled inside. It felt like being struck by lightning. The air crackled around her. He knew. Somehow, this impossible, terrifying king knew she was there. He began to walk down the aisle. The pack parted before him, a wave receding from a jagged cliff. Not a single wolf dared to meet his eye, but his gaze never left Isolde. With every step he took, a strange, forgotten hum started deep in her bones, a resonance she hadn't felt since her bond with Rhys had been destroyed. It was faint, a bare whisper, but it was there. He stopped a dozen paces from the altar, perfectly between her and the bride and groom. He didn't turn to address the alpha or the elder. He kept his burning eye fixed on Isolde, hidden in the dark. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the stone floor, a sound of gravel and menace and absolute authority. "You're marrying the wrong woman." The words hung in the dead air, sharp and lethal as obsidian shards. Before anyone could process their meaning, a sound tore from the king's throat. It was not human. It was a howl, a deep, earth-shaking primal roar of a wolf so ancient and powerful it felt like the mountain itself had given voice. And as the last echo of it died, a searing, white-hot agony erupted on the back of Isolde's neck. She cried out, a choked, voiceless gasp, her hands flying to the spot where a mate's mark should have been. It felt as if a star had just been born beneath her skin, branding her from the inside out. Her pain was not her own. A collective scream tore through the hall. Every mated wolf clutched at their own mark, crying out as the king's proclamation, backed by the sheer power of his will, sent a shockwave through every bond. Lyra crumpled at the altar, shrieking. Rhys staggered back, his hand at his own neck, his face a mask of confusion and agony. Fate had not just rewritten its choice. It had set their entire world on fire, and Isolde was standing at the very heart of the inferno. The howl had shattered the world. Now, in its wake, there was only the sound of pain. A cacophony of shrieks and groans filled the great hall as the pack writhed, clutching at the invisible fire consuming their mating marks. Isolde's own hand was pressed tight against the back of her neck, where a phantom brand pulsed with an agony so real, so profound, it felt as if her soul were being torn open and remade. Through the haze of her own torment, she saw Lyra on the floor, weeping. She saw Rhys, his face pale and contorted, staring at his hands as if they'd betrayed him. Even Alpha Valerius, a man who prided himself on his iron control, was gritting his teeth, a sheen of sweat on his brow. And in the center of it all, King Corvin Drain stood unmoved, an island of granite in a sea of chaos. The power that had emanated from him, that had hijacked every sacred bond in the room, now settled, coiling around him like a visible cloak of shadow and might. The burning on Isolde's skin began to subside. leaving behind a deep, resonant hum, a thrumming awareness that was terrifyingly new. It was a connection, a live wire running from the base of her skull directly to the dark, silent figure, who now held the entire room in his thrall. His molten amber eye found her again in the gloom. The intensity of it was a physical force, pinning her to the spot. He began to move, his stride unhurried, purposeful. He walked past the altar, past the fallen bride and the faithless groom, and did not spare them a single glance. His focus was singular. It was absolute. It was on her. Isolde's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the lingering shock. This was the Wolf King, a man forged in ice and war, a king who ruled the harshest lands with a fist of iron. Legend said he communed with spirits, that his own wolf was a demon bound in flesh. What could he possibly want with a broken, wolfless Omega? He stopped directly in front of her, so close she was forced to crane her neck back to see his face. He was a mountain of a man, casting her in a complete and total shadow. She could smell the scent clinging to him, the sharp, clean bite of northern pines, the cold steel of armor, and something else, something wild and ancient, like frost on old stone. He lifted a hand, and she flinched, a lifetime of expecting blows making her body recoil. But he didn't strike. His fingers, calloused and scarred, went to her neck. His touch was surprisingly gentle, yet possessed a weight that spoke of immense, restrained power. He brushed his thumb over the spot that still hummed with that strange, new energy. A jolt, like lightning, shot down her spine. His eye narrowed, not in anger, but in what looked like grim confirmation. His gaze held hers, and for a heart-stopping moment, she felt as if he could hear the silent scream of her thoughts. "She comes with me," he said. The words a low rumble meant not for her, but for the room at large. The statement, so simple and absolute, finally broke the spell of fear. Alpha Valerius staggered forward, his face a mask of outrage and disbelief. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice strained. "You cannot. This is a Silverwood matter. She is one of ours." King Corvin didn't even turn to look at him. His gaze remained locked on Isolde. "She is yours no longer. The fates have spoken. You were simply too deaf to hear them. She is a curse." Valerius spat, desperation making him reckless. "A wolfless Omega. Mute. She is nothing. A disgrace we have sheltered out of pity. She cannot be what you think." The king's aura flared, and the temperature in the hall dropped by 20 degrees. A low, menacing growl vibrated in his chest, a sound that promised violence. This time, he did turn his head, just enough to pin Valerius with his burning amber eye. "You speak of curses, Valerius, while standing in a hall full of broken bonds because of your ignorance." Corvin's voice was lethal, each word a perfectly aimed dart. "You took a sacred bond, one woven by the moon herself, and you tried to shred it with your pathetic traditions. You mutilated a soul because you feared what you could not understand. That is the only curse I see here." His gaze flickered to Rhys, who was now standing, swaying on his feet, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. She was my mate," Rhys whispered, the words sounding hollow and foolish even to Isolde's ears. "Was," the king corrected, the single word a final, damning judgment. He turned his attention fully back to Isolde. The anger in his expression softened infinitesimally, replaced by something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was something harder, deeper, recognition, perhaps. He saw the torn hem of her tunic, the smudges of dirt on her skin, the way she held herself as if waiting for the next blow. He saw it all. And in his eye, she saw not disgust, but the faintest flicker of a shared desolation. "They will not harm you again," he stated. It was not a promise. It was a fact. He took a half step back, a silent invitation. The entire hall held its breath. This was her moment, her choice. But what choice was there? To stay here, in the ruins of her life, a pariah hated and shamed by everyone she had ever known? To watch the man who had abandoned her build a life with another, while she slowly faded into nothing in the shadows? Or to go with this terrifying, scarred king, into a future as unknown and forbidding as the northern mountains from which he came? It was a choice between a familiar hell and a terrifying unknown. She looked at Rhys one last time. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw it all. The regret, the confusion, the weakness that had allowed him to cast her aside. There was no love there, not anymore. There was only the ghost of what might have been, and ghosts could not keep her warm. Slowly, deliberately, Isolde took a single step out of the shadows, and then another. She walked away from the wall she had hidden behind for so long and stopped at the king's side. She did not look at him, but stared straight ahead, at the broken doors and the dark, waiting night beyond. She felt the collective shock of the pack, a wave of disbelief and fury. She heard Lyra's sharp, indrawn breath, but she did not falter. A small, grim smile touched the corner of Corvin's mouth. He reached out, not to take her hand, but to unfasten the great, heavy cloak from his own shoulders. It was made of wolf pelts, black as a moonless night, and lined with thick fur. He settled it around her, and its weight was both a burden and a shield. It swallowed her small frame, and the scent of him, pine and winter and power, enveloped her completely. It was an act of claiming, a public declaration more powerful than any vow. "My king, I forbid this," Alpha Valerius roared, finally finding his courage, or his foolishness. Corvin didn't even pause. "Try to stop me," he rumbled over his shoulder, a clear challenge. Valerius and his warriors stood frozen, their instincts screaming at them that to challenge this wolf was suicide. With a firm hand on the small of her back, Corvin guided Isolde down the aisle. The pack scrambled out of their way, their fear a palpable thing. They were leaving, truly leaving. The cold night air hit her face as they stepped over the threshold, a bracing shock after the suffocating atmosphere of the hall. Outside, a monstrous black warhorse stood waiting, its eyes gleaming in the dark, its breath pluming in the chill. Several dark-clad guards, silent as wraiths, materialized from the trees, their own mounts in tow. Corvin lifted her as if she weighed nothing, setting her on the front of the massive saddle before swinging up, behind her. She was caged in by his arms, her back pressed against the hard planes of his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her spine. It was a rhythm of absolute calm, absolute control. He looked down at her. In the moonlight, he saw the single, silent tear that tracked its way through the grime on her cheek. His voice was a low growl in her ear, devoid of sympathy. "Tears for them? Or for yourself?" She thought of the years of silent shame, of Rhys's betrayal, of a life that had been stolen from her. She thought of the pain and the loneliness. And then she thought of the future, a terrifying blank page dominated by the man who now held her. She shook her head, a small, sharp gesture. "Not for them. Never for them." "Good," he murmured, his breath a warm ghost against her ear. "We have no time for ghosts." With a sharp command to his horse, he spurred the great beast forward, and they plunged into the deep, unforgiving darkness of the fawn forest, leaving the Silverwood pack and the ashes of Isolde's life behind. The journey north was a descent into a colder, harder world. The soft earth and lush woods of Silverwood territory gave way to jagged rock and sentinel pines that clawed at a bruised twilight sky. For hours, Isolde rode in a state of suspended shock, a silent passenger in a fate she had not chosen. She was cocooned in the king's enormous cloak, her body wedged between the high pommel of the saddle and the unyielding wall of his chest. The rhythmic sway of the warhorse was a monotonous lullaby of flight, each hoofbeat carrying her further from the only life she'd known, a life of familiar pain, into an abyss of terrifying uncertainty. Her world had shrunk to a collection of raw sensations. The biting wind that found the gaps in her borrowed warmth, the constant, solid pressure of Corvin's body at her back, a source of both primal fear and an unsettling security. The scent of him was overwhelming pine, cold iron, and the musky, dominant scent of his wolf, a fragrance so potent it seemed to seep directly into her bloodstream. It was nothing like Rhys's scent of riverstone and summer grass. This was the scent of winter itself, of dominance and survival. And beneath it all, the hum. The strange, thrumming energy at the base of her skull pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a secret rhythm only she could feel. It was a tether, a brand, an anchor, pulling her toward this formidable stranger. His guards rode like ghosts, their movements economical and silent, their faces hidden by the shadows of their cowls. They never spoke, communicating with subtle shifts in weight and barely perceptible hand signals. They were wolves, she knew. But they moved with the discipline of men who had seen too much war. They were his pack, a pack of shadows and steel. They stopped only once, as the moon began to pale toward dawn. In a shallow, wind-swept ravine, one of the guards built a small, smokeless fire with practiced efficiency. Corvin dismounted in one fluid motion, then reached up for her. His hand spanned her waist, lifting her down as if she were a doll. Her legs, numb and weak, threatened to buckle, but he held her steady for a moment longer than necessary, his grip like iron bands. He released her and turned to the fire without a word. One of his men offered him a water skin and a piece of dried meat. Corvin drank, then held the skin out to her. Isolde hesitated, her gaze darting from the water skin to his impassive face. His scarred eye seemed to see straight through her, anticipating her fear, her defiance. There was no kindness in his expression, only a flat, unwavering expectation. She took it, her trembling fingers brushing his. The contact sent another jolt through the bond at her neck, sharp and startling. She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her dry throat. He broke the jerky in two and handed her a piece. It was tough and salty, and she chewed it slowly, forcing herself to swallow. It was fuel, nothing more. Around the fire, no one spoke. The silence was different from the stifling quiet of her shame in Silverwood. This was a comfortable silence, the quiet of predators at rest, confident in their power. Corvin stared into the flames, his jaw tight, the firelight carving deep shadows into the harsh planes of his face. He looked weary, not tired, but a deeper, soul-deep weariness, as if he carried the weight of his entire kingdom on his massive shoulders. For the first time, she saw him not just as a terrifying king or a mythical beast, but as a man scarred, burdened, and utterly alone. The thought was so unexpected it startled her. The journey resumed. They climbed higher, the air growing thin and sharp. Snow began to dust the ground, clinging to the dark branches of the firs, and then, as the first rays of a weak, watery sun broke over the eastern peaks, she saw it. Drainkeep. It was not a castle. It was a fortress, a titan of black granite that seemed to grow organically from the mountain's peak, its towers piercing the clouds like jagged shards of obsidian. It was a monument to defiance, built to withstand not just armies, but the brutal, unforgiving northern winters. No banners flew from its ramparts, no concessions were made to beauty. It was a place of pure, unadorned strength, a place that perfectly mirrored the king who ruled from it. Awe and terror warred within her. This was her new home, her cage. The great iron gates groaned open for them, and they rode into a vast, wind-scoured courtyard. Stable hands emerged from the shadows to take the horses, their heads bowed low, their movements swift and silent. No one dared meet the king's eye. He dismounted and once again lifted her down, his hand lingering at the small of her back as he guided her toward the main entrance. The inside of the keep was even more imposing than the outside. The great hall was a cavern of shadow and stone, its vaulted ceiling lost in darkness far above. Torches set in iron sconces cast flickering, dancing light on walls of bare, black rock. The air was cold, smelling of wood smoke and old stone. A few servants moved through the gloom like specters, their footsteps echoing in the crushing silence. There were no moon blossoms here, no laughter, no warmth. This was a place stripped of all softness. Corvin led her through a labyrinth of stone corridors, his boots ringing on the floor, her own soft shoes making no sound at all. He did not lead her to a guest chamber or a servant's quarters. He stopped before a set of massive, iron-bound oak doors and pushed them open. The room was vast and Spartan. A huge hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within. A massive bed, piled high with black and gray furs, stood on a raised dais. An enormous table was littered with maps and strategic markers. A set of armor stood gleaming darkly in a corner. It was a warrior king's chamber, a room for sleeping and for planning wars. It was his room. He closed the door behind them, the heavy thud shutting out the rest of the world. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the hiss and pop of the fire. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Take off the cloak," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. Her fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the heavy clasp. The cloak slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. Without its weight and warmth, she felt small and exposed in her rough, plain tunic. The firelight revealed the threadbare patches, the stains, the undeniable mark of her former station. She was a stray, a piece of refuse brought into a king's private domain. She braced herself for the disgust, the dismissal. He walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not look at her clothes. His gaze was fixed on her face, his amber eye searching her features as if trying to decipher a map. "Do you know what I have done?" he asked, his voice softer now, but no less intense. She could only stare back at him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. What could she do? Nod? Shake her head? She was a ship without a rudder, her silence a constant betrayal. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. They broke your bond with him, he stated, not a question. They used old, crude magic to slice it away, but they could not destroy it entirely. They only buried it, wounded it. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly gentle against her cold skin. When I howled in that hall, I did not just challenge their laws. I called to the fates. I called to the thread of the bond they tried to kill. His hand moved from her jaw to the back of her neck, his thumb finding the place where the phantom energy hummed and pulsed. A shiver racked her body at his touch. This is not a phantom, he murmured, his voice a low growl that vibrated through her bones. What you feel is not the ghost of your old bond awakening. It's the first thread of a new one. I did not just sever you from him. I claimed you. I bound you to me. The truth of his words crashed over her with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't a rescue. This was a conquest. He hadn't freed her from her cage in Silverwood. He had merely unlocked the door, carried her across the threshold, and locked her in his own. A much larger, colder, and infinitely more dangerous cage. His eye burned into hers, demanding a response she could not give. You belong to the North. Now, he said, his thumb pressing down on the nascent mark, sealing his claim. You belong to me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold as the stone walls. You belong to me. They were chains, forged in the fire of his howl, and cooled in the icy finality of his tone. Isolde stood frozen, the fine, northern-spun tunic they'd given her feeling, alien against her skin. It was dark wool, the color of a stormy sea, simple but exquisitely made. It was a queen's garment, and it felt like a costume. Beneath it, her skin was clean, scrubbed raw by a grim, silent servant named Helga, who had handled her with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of a butcher preparing meat. The warmth from the bath had already leached away, leaving her chilled to the bone. Corvin had left her in the care of the old woman, disappearing back into the bowels of his fortress, leaving Isolde to grapple with the seismic shift in her reality. She was a possession, a spoil of a war she hadn't even known was being fought. The nascent bond at her neck was a constant, low thrum, a leash held by a king whose thoughts were a closed, frozen landscape. Now he was back. He had returned as silently as he had left, standing by the hearth, one hand resting on the stone mantelpiece. The firelight danced on his scarred face, making the blind eye a milky void and the good one a pit of molten gold. He had been watching her, she realized, watching her stand in the center of his chambers like a lost lamb in a wolf's den. The woman, Helga, he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence. She will see to your needs. You will want for nothing here. It wasn't an offer of comfort. It was a statement of fact, a clarification of the terms of her gilded cage. She would be fed, clothed, and sheltered. A prized falcon, hooded and tethered, with no sky to fly in. Isolde's hands clenched into fists at her sides. A spark of defiance, something she thought had been extinguished years ago, flickered to life in the frozen wasteland of her heart. She couldn't speak, couldn't argue, couldn't scream her rage at the injustice of it all. But she could stand. She could meet his gaze. She could refuse to be cowed. She lifted her chin, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was the only weapon she had. A flicker of something surprise, respect, passed through his good eye. He pushed away from the mantelpiece and walked toward the large basin of water the servants had left. He unclasped the leather bracers from his forearms, the metal plates clattering onto the table. Then, he reached for the lacings of his heavy leather tunic. Isolde's breath caught. She instinctively took a step back, her defiance crumbling into raw, primal fear. Her mind screamed, what did he intend? To claim her now, fully? To mark his ownership on her body as he had on her soul? Her blood ran cold. He pulled the tunic over his head in one swift motion and tossed it onto a chair. He turned his back to her, standing shirtless in the firelight, and began to wash the grime of the journey from his face and neck. And Isolde forgot how to breathe. His back was not the back of a man. It was a testament to a brutal life, a tapestry of violence woven in scar tissue. A lattice of silvered agony crisscrossed his broad shoulders and powerful torso. Some were the thin, clean lines of sword cuts. Others were the jagged, puckered marks of claws. One massive, horrific scar ran from his left shoulder blade down to his right hip, a deep, wide trough where the flesh had been torn away and had healed into a gruesome landscape of its own. It was a map of every battle he had ever fought, every war he had ever won. She had seen scars on the warriors of her pack, but those were marks of prowess, of minor skirmishes. These were marks of survival. These were the wounds of a man who had walked through hell and had clawed his way out, bringing the fire with him. The sight was terrifying, but beneath the terror, a strange and unwelcome emotion stirred, a profound, aching empathy. The silent language of pain was one she understood intimately. Her own scars were on the inside, invisible but just as deep. The bond at her neck pulsed, a sharp, sudden throb. And with it came something new. A scent, not the scent of pine and winter that clung to his skin, but a phantom smell that rose from the scars themselves, the ghost of old blood, of iron, of pain so immense it had left a permanent echo in the air around him. She could almost feel the memory of the wounds, a cold ache that resonated deep in her own bones. It was the bond, she realized with a dawning horror. It was a bridge between them, a conduit not just for his claim, but for his past, for his pain. He finished washing and turned, reaching for a clean linen cloth. He saw where she was looking. He saw the shock, the horror, and the flicker of something else in her eyes. He didn't try to cover himself. He stood there, letting her see, his expression unreadable, his amber eye challenging her to look away. She couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the stone floor. The man who had stolen her life, who had bound her to him with raw power, was also a man who was covered in the evidence of his own suffering. The two truths warred within her, creating a confusing, dizzying turmoil. He walked toward her, and this time, she did not retreat. He stopped an arm's length away. The heat from his body washed over her. He was so large, so powerful. The sheer physical reality of him was overwhelming. "Every king in the north is forged in battle," he said, his voice quiet, matter of fact. "The weak do not survive the winter. They do not survive the throne." He was giving her an explanation, or perhaps a warning. "This is who I am. This is what it costs to be me." And then she did something that surprised them both. It was not a thought, not a decision, but an instinct, a compulsion that rose from the deepest part of her being, guided by the humming connection between them. She lifted a hand, her fingers trembling. The air between them crackled with a sudden, unbearable tension. He watched her, his body going unnaturally still, every muscle tensing as if for a blow. His wolf was close to the surface. She could feel it, a feral, dangerous presence held in check by a thread of iron will. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the great, gouged scar on his side. His skin was hot beneath her cold touch. He flinched, a sharp, violent jerk, and a low growl ripped from his chest, involuntary and savage. His good eye blazed, the pupil dilating until it was almost entirely black. He caught her wrist, his grip like a manacle. For a second, she thought he would break it. The sheer, untamed power rolling off him was terrifying. He was a storm, a force of nature, and she had just touched the lightning. But he didn't hurt her. He held her wrist, his thumb pressing against the frantic pulse there, his gaze locked on her face. He was breathing heavily, fighting for a control she hadn't realized was so precarious. "Why?" he snarled, the single word more a demand than a question. "Is it pity? Do not waste it on me." She couldn't answer. How could she explain that for a fleeting moment? She hadn't seen a king or a captor. She had seen a fellow, survivor. How could she tell him that the bond between them had shown her a glimpse of the agony he carried, and her soul had, against all reason, reached out to his? She shook her head desperately, trying to convey the truth with her eyes. Not pity, recognition. His grip on her wrist gentled, but did not release. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, the battle within him slowly subsiding. The feral blaze in his eye cooled to a smoldering ember. "My wolf," he said, his voice a raw, strained whisper. "It is violent, old. It has not known a gentle hand since I was a boy." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "It recognized you in that hall. Not as a mate. I have no need for such sentiment." He pulled her hand, still trapped in his, to his chest, pressing her palm flat against the hard, warm muscle over his heart. Beneath her hand, she could feel the powerful, steady beat. But underneath that, through the bond, she could feel something else. A chaotic, raging storm. A wildness so profound it threatened to consume him. "It recognized you as an anchor," he breathed, his eye boring into hers, revealing a sliver of raw, desperate vulnerability. As the only thing in this world that can quiet the storm. That is why I took you, Isolde. Not for a crown or a queen, but for a leash, for silence. The word settled in the vast, cold space between them. Silence. It was not the silence of her muteness, a void of sound. It was the silence he craved, a cessation of the internal war that raged within him. She was not his queen, not his mate. She was his cure, a living poultice for a soul-deep wound. The revelation was more terrifying than any threat of violence. To be needed in such a way was a form of bondage far more intricate and inescapable than simple servitude. His heart beat a steady, powerful rhythm under her palm, a lie that contradicted the chaotic storm she could now feel churning beneath, a maelstrom held in check by the sheer force of his will. His confession hung in the air, a raw, bleeding thing. The vulnerability in his eye was fleeting, quickly shuttered behind the familiar mask of command. He released her wrist, the warmth of his grip vanishing, and took a step back. The distance he created was both physical and emotional, a king retreating back into his fortress of solitude. "Helga will show you the rest of the keep tomorrow," he said, his voice once again a flat, emotionless rumble. He turned away, pulling on a simple linen shirt, covering the map of his pain. "You are not a prisoner, but you will not leave the walls of Drainkeep. The north is not Silverwood. It is filled with men who would see my anchor broken." The implication was clear. Her value was tied directly to him. Her safety was a matter of his own self-preservation. He strode to the massive table littered with maps, his back to her, a silent dismissal. The moment of raw honesty was over. The cage, now defined, was locked. Isolde retreated to the far side of the room, to a small alcove with a narrow, arrow-slit window. She curled up on the cold stone ledge, pulling the furs from a nearby chest around her, and watched him. He did not sleep. All through the long northern night, he worked. He studied the maps, moved carved wooden markers representing troops and territories, his jaw set in grim concentration. The storm inside him did not vanish, but it subsided to a low, distant thunder, a constant pressure at the edge of her senses, transmitted through the humming bond at her neck. It was a headache she couldn't soothe, a song she couldn't unhear, and she began to understand. To live as he did, with that constant raging chaos, must be a unique form of hell. The days that followed fell into a strange, Spartan routine. Helga, a woman who seemed carved from the same granite as the keep, would arrive at dawn with a tray of food, oatcakes, dried meat, strong, bitter tea. She never tried to speak to Isolde, her movements, economical and devoid of any emotion. But Isolde would sometimes see the old woman's gaze linger on the back of her neck, where the nascent bond was a faint shimmer in the air, a mark of something the North had never seen before. There was no pity in the woman's eyes, but there was a flicker of something akin to awe, or perhaps fear. Isolde explored her gilded cage. Drainkeep was a world of stone and shadow, built for war, not for living. The corridors were cold drafts. The halls were echoing voids. There was no music, no laughter, no scent of baking bread. The pack here was not a family. It was a garrison. The wolves she saw were soldiers, their faces hard, their eyes watchful. They bowed their heads as she passed, their deference given not to her, but to the king's mark she wore. She was a symbol, an extension of his power, and it was a lonely, isolating existence. She spent hours in the keep's library, a dusty, forgotten room filled with ancient tomes and brittle scrolls. She couldn't speak, but she could read. She devoured histories of the North, tales of brutal wars and legendary beasts. She learned of the Draen line, a lineage of kings who were said to carry the blood of the first wolves, ancient, primal creatures of immense power and uncontrollable rage. The scrolls spoke of the Draen fury, a madness that claimed the kings who could not master the beast within. They became monsters, eventually turning on their own people, and had to be put down. Corvin was not just fighting rival clans or treacherous lords. He was fighting his own bloodline. He was fighting himself. At night, she would return to his chambers. It was her designated space, though it never felt like hers. He was often there, working at his maps or sparring with his captain in the courtyard below, his movements brutal and efficient. They rarely interacted. They were two ghosts haunting the same space, bound by a connection that was as intimate as a lover's touch and as impersonal as a shackle. But she could always feel him. The bond was a constant companion. When he was in council, she could feel the dull throb of his frustration. When he rode out with his scouts, She felt the cold bite of the wind as if on her own skin. And when the storm in him stirred, she felt it as a growing pressure behind her eyes, a coiling tension in her own gut. One evening, nearly a week after her arrival, the storm broke. She was in his chambers, trying to read by the firelight, when the doors burst open. Corvin strode in, followed by 2 of his generals. He was radiating a black, furious energy. The air around him crackled with it. The bond at her neck flared, sending a wave of searing, vicarious rage through her. It was so potent, it made her gasp, the book tumbling from her lap. Lord Vorlag defies the edict. One of the generals, a grim-faced man with a scarred lip, was saying. He refuses to send his grain tithe. He says the southern passes belong to him now. He says the king is distracted. The other general added, casting a wary, resentful glance at Isolde. By southern softness, Corvin slammed his fist down on the great map table. The wooden markers jumped and scattered. The sound was like a thunderclap in the stone room. Vorlag is a dog who mistakes patience for weakness, Corvin snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl that was more wolf than man. His good eye was a blazing inferno. The fury. She could feel it rising in him, a tide of black, uncontrollable violence. The phantom scent of old blood and iron from his scars filled the room, a memory of pain feeding a present rage. The pressure in Isolde's head was immense. His rage felt like her own. It screamed for release, for blood and bone and breaking things. Her hands trembled, her nails digging into her palms. She understood now what he meant. This wasn't just anger. It was an entity, a monster that lived behind his ribs, and it was rattling the bars of its cage. The generals took a step back, their hands instinctively going to the hilts of their swords. They had seen this before. They knew the danger. Corvin turned, pacing like a caged beast. I will ride to his hold myself. I will tear his treason from his throat and hang his hide from his own battlements. The bond screamed. The fury was cresting, about to spill over. Isolde felt a wave of dizziness, her vision swimming. If he gave into it, it would consume him. And perhaps, through this terrible connection, it would consume her, too. Without thinking, driven by a desperate instinct for self-preservation, she moved. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the raging king. The generals watched her, their eyes wide with alarm. "My lady, stay back," one of them warned. But she didn't stop. She walked directly into the heart of the storm. She reached him as he turned, his face a mask of feral rage, his canines slightly elongated. He looked at her, but she wasn't sure he was even seeing her. He was seeing red. She lifted her hand. It was the same gesture as that first night, but this time there was no hesitation. She laid her palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The black rage pouring from him didn't just stop. It shattered, like a wave crashing against a rock. He staggered back a step, a harsh, guttural gasp tearing from his throat. The inferno in his eye flickered, the blaze receding, leaving behind stunned, bewildered embers. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then up at her face, his breath coming in ragged pants. The storm had passed. The silence had fallen. Her touch had been the leash. The 2 generals stared, their mouths agape, their faces a mixture of disbelief and utter reverence. They had just witnessed a miracle. They had just seen their king pulled back from the brink, not by force of will or by strength of arms, but by the silent, steady touch of the broken. Omega, from the south. Corvin's gaze was locked with hers. The mask was gone. In his eye, she saw no anger, no command. She saw only a raw, terrifying need. He saw his anchor. He saw the only thing that stood between his crown and his curse. He slowly reached up, his large, scarred hand covering hers, pressing it tighter against his chest, as if he were afraid she would pull away. "Stay," he rasped, the word a raw, broken plea. The silence he craved wasn't just an absence of his wolf's rage. It was her. The word stay echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the chamber. It was not a command, but a confession, a raw admission of a weakness he had spent a lifetime concealing behind walls of stone and scars. His hand, covering hers, was a brand, pressing the truth of her purpose into her skin. She was his calm, his silence, and in that moment, she understood that the bars of her cage were not made of iron or stone, but of his desperate, terrifying need. The 2 generals, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and awe, quietly backed out of the room, pulling the heavy doors shut behind them. They left the king and his anchor alone in the aftermath of the storm. Corvin did not release her. He stood there, breathing deeply, his eyes closed for a moment as if savoring the quiet in his own soul. The bond between them, which had been a screaming, violent current of his rage, now settled into a gentle, humming flow. It was a current of profound relief, and it washed over Isolde, soothing the frantic edges of her own fear. He was no longer a terrifying king or a feral beast. He was just a man, leaning on a fragile piece of driftwood in a tempest. He finally opened his eye, the molten gold now clear and focused. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the distance he had so carefully maintained between them collapsed into nothing. "How?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The old texts spoke of anchors, of soul bonds that could temper the fury, but it was legend, a myth. How does a touch from you accomplish what a lifetime of discipline has failed to do? Isolde could offer no answer. She could only meet his gaze, her heart aching with a strange, conflicting brew of emotions. Fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was joined by a reluctant empathy, and something else, something she was terrified to name, a sense of belonging. In this harsh, cold fortress, in the presence of this broken, violent man, she had a purpose for the first time in her life. She wasn't a curse or a burden, she was a necessity. He seemed to find the answer in her silent eyes. A grim understanding settled on his features. "It is the bond," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The fates were not cruel, they were precise. He finally released her hand, and the loss of contact was a sudden, sharp cold. He turned and walked to the arrow-slit window, staring out at the snow-dusted peaks that pierced the darkening sky. "Vorlag still needs to be answered," he said, his back to her. "His challenge cannot be ignored. The lords of the north respect only strength. To show anything else is to invite the wolves to your throat." Isolde's blood ran cold. He meant to ride out, to face this rebellious lord and the violence that would inevitably follow. And he would be riding away from her, away from his anchor. The thought sent a jolt of pure panic through the bond, a fear that was not entirely her own. It was his fear, a deep, primal terror of the beast within, bleeding through their connection. She walked to stand beside him at the window. The cold from the stone seeped through the soles of her shoes. Outside, the world was a study in shades of gray and white, unforgiving and vast. She placed a hand on his arm. It was a tentative gesture, a silent question. "What will you do?" He looked down at her hand, then back out at the mountains. "I will take you with me." The words were a shock. Not a shock of fear, but of surprise. He was not casting her aside to go to war. He was bringing his shield with him. The pragmatic, military logic of it was undeniable. And yet, it felt like more than that. It felt like an admission that he could no longer face the darkness alone. "It will be dangerous," he continued, his voice a low growl. "Vorlag's keep is a nest of vipers, but the danger of leaving you behind, of letting the fury ride me unchecked, that is a greater danger. For me, and for my kingdom." He turned to face her fully, his expression hard, resolute. "We ride at dawn. Helga will provide you with what you need." The journey to Vorlag's domain was a descent into an even harsher landscape. They rode with a retinue of 50 of Corvin's elite guards, the Silent Guard, their black cloaks blending into the shadows of the pine forests. Isolde was mounted on a sturdy, sure-footed mare, bundled in thick furs, riding beside the king. The cold was a physical entity, a predator, that gnawed at any exposed skin. But the proximity to Corvin kept a strange, internal warmth kindled within her. The bond was a steady, humming presence, a quiet reassurance in the bleak wilderness. She watched him, studied him. He was a different man outside the walls of his keep. Here, in the wild, he seemed more at ease, more a part of the landscape. He moved with a predator's grace, his senses constantly attuned to the world around him. He spoke little, but when he gave orders, his men obeyed without question. They respected him, she realized, but they also feared the thing he carried inside him. She saw the way they glanced at her, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and a desperate hope. She was their king's leash, and their own survival might well depend on her strength. Vorlag's keep was a jagged fortress clinging to a cliffside over a frozen river, a place that reeked of defiance. Banners bearing the sigil of a snarling ice bear snapped in the wind, a direct insult to the king's authority. As they approached, the gates remained shut, the ramparts lined with archers. Lord Vorlag himself appeared on the battlements, a burly, bearded man with cruel, calculating eyes. "King Corvin!" he boomed, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "To what do we owe this honor? Have you come to beg for your grain, your majesty?" Corvin sat his warhorse, unmoved. The air around him grew cold, the pressure of the rising fury a palpable thing against Isolde's senses. She felt the first stirrings of the storm, the low thunder in his blood. "I have come for your fealty, Vorlag." Corvin's voice was a low, deadly rumble that carried effortlessly across the distance. "You will open your gates, lay your banners at my feet, and deliver the grain you owe your king. Or I will burn this fortress to the ground and salt the earth with the ashes of your line." Vorlag laughed, a harsh grating sound. "Your threats are as empty as your storehouses, Draen. We all hear the whispers. The fury rides you. You are a king on the edge of madness, a rabid dog who will soon need to be put down." The storm broke. Isolde felt it as a physical blow, a wave of pure, black rage that surged through the bond. The pressure in her head was blinding. Corvin's horse shifted nervously, sensing the change in its rider. A low growl tore from the king's throat, and his good eye began to blaze with that terrifying, inhuman light. This was it, the test. Before he could give the order to attack, before the fury could consume him completely, Isolde acted. She urged her mare forward, closing the space between them. She reached out and laid her hand on his gauntlet-clad forearm. His entire body went rigid. The rage faltered, its momentum broken by her touch. He turned to look at her, his face a contorted mask of his inner battle. He was fighting it, fighting harder than she had ever seen him fight. Through the bond, she poured all her own quiet strength, all her desperate will for peace, for silence. She focused on him, becoming a singular point of calm in his internal hurricane. Slowly, painstakingly, the red haze in his vision began to clear. The feral blaze in his eye subsided. He took a long, shuddering breath, the growl in his chest dying. On the battlements, Vorlag watched, his laughter dying in his throat, his expression turning to one of utter confusion. He had expected a mindless, berserker charge. He was met instead with a king who had mastered his own demon. Corvin turned his gaze back to the fortress, his voice now devoid of rage, filled with a cold, terrifying certainty. "This is your last chance, Vorlag. Open the gates." Seeing his gambit fail, seeing the king in perfect control, Vorlag's arrogance crumbled into fear. The gates of the keep groaned open. Corvin rode in, Isolde at his side, his silent guard fanning out behind him. Lord Vorlag stood in the courtyard, his men looking nervous and uncertain. He bowed, a stiff, resentful gesture. "Your Majesty," he gritted out. Corvin dismounted and strode toward him. He did not draw his sword. He simply looked down at the rebellious lord, his presence more intimidating than any weapon. "The grain will be on its way by morning," he stated, "and your eldest son will return with me to Draenkeep, as my ward, to learn what loyalty means." It was a brilliant stroke, a punishment that did not require bloodshed, a political move that would secure Vorlag's obedience for years to come. It was the act of a king, not a berserker. As they turned to leave, his hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. It was not a gesture of affection. It was a gesture of necessity, of acknowledgement. In the cold, brutal world of the North, they had forged a new kind of alliance, a pact made not of vows and promises, but of blood and bone, and the desperate, shared need for silence. The return to Draenkeep was a triumph cloaked in the grim quiet of the North. News of Lord Vorlag's capitulation traveled faster than their horses, carried on the winter winds. They arrived to find the courtyard filled with the lords and ladies of the northern houses, their expressions a mixture of fear and newfound respect. They had come to see the king who had faced down his own fury and bent a traitor to his will without spilling a drop of blood. And they had come to see the woman who had made it possible. As Corvin dismounted, his gaze swept over the assembled nobles, a silent warning and a reassertion of his power. He turned and lifted Isolde down from her mare, his hands lingering at her waist. He did not release her immediately. Instead, he kept her standing before him, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, turning them into a single, united front. Isolde felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. They were not the scornful, pitying stares of the Silverwood pack. This was different. This was the calculating assessment of a royal court. They saw her plain, southern tunic, her lack of adornment, her silence, but they also saw the king's hand on her back. They saw the way he stood, a shield between her and the world, and they saw the faint, otherworldly shimmer of the bond at her neck. She was no longer a broken omega. She was the king's anchor, a figure of myth and power, a mystery they were all desperate to solve. "My lords," Corvin's voice boomed, cutting through the silence. "You see that the North is united, that our laws are absolute. You will return to your keeps and remember what it means to serve the Dran crown." It was a dismissal. The court bowed, a wave of submission, and began to disperse, their whispers following Isolde and Corvin as he led her into the great hall. Inside, the hall was warmer than she remembered. The great hearth roared, casting a golden, dancing light on the black stone walls. Servants moved with a new energy, a purpose that had been absent before. The victory, over Vorlag and over the king's own demon, had breathed life back into the stoic heart of Draenkeep. Corvin led her not to his chambers, but to a massive, throne-like chair that stood on a raised dais at the head of the hall. It was his seat of power, a throne carved from a single, massive piece of obsidian, its arms shaped like snarling wolves. He did not sit. Instead, he gestured for her to do so. Isolde froze, her eyes wide with shock. This was his throne, the seat of the Wolf King. To sit there was an act of unbelievable presumption. She shook her head, taking a step back. His expression softened, a rare, fleeting thing. He took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. "The strength to rule this kingdom," he said, his voice low, for her ears only, "does not come from this chair, Isolde. It comes from the silence you give me. You are as much a ruler of this land as I am. This is your seat, too." The raw sincerity in his voice was undeniable. He was not just giving her a place of honor. He was acknowledging a fundamental truth. His reign, his very sanity, was now inextricably linked to her. Without her, he was just a man wrestling a monster. With her, he was a king. Slowly, hesitantly, she allowed him to lead her to the throne. She sat, the cold, smooth obsidian, a shock against her back. The furs lining the seat were soft, but she felt perched, out of place, a fragile bird in a dragon's nest. The hall looked impossibly vast from this vantage point, the people in it small and distant. Corvin did not sit beside her. He stood next to the throne, a sentinel, his hand resting on the carved wolf's head at her shoulder. The image was a powerful one, a clear and public declaration. She was not just his anchor, she was his partner, his queen in all but name. That evening, a great feast was held. The hall, usually a cavern of echoing silence, was filled with the sounds of conversation, of clanking goblets, of a bard singing old, mournful, northern epics. The lords and ladies who had been so quick to whisper and plot now approached the dais to offer their fealty, their eyes darting from Corvin's impassive face to Isolde's silent one. She endured their scrutiny, their veiled questions, their probing stares. She was a silent queen, an enigma. Her muteness, once her greatest shame, had become a source of power. They could not read her, could not flatter or manipulate her with words. Her silence made her untouchable, mysterious. She simply watched them, her gaze steady, and they retreated, unnerved by the quiet strength they saw there. Corvin never left her side. He was a constant, solid presence. He would lean down, his voice a low rumble in her ear, explaining the complex politics of the court, identifying the loyal lords from the treacherous ones, his breath warm against her skin. The bond between them was a calm, steady river, a current of shared purpose. For the first time, it did not feel like a leash. It felt like a bridge. Later, when the feast was winding down and the hall was growing quiet, an old, white-haired lord, the ancient head of the Silvermane clan, approached the throne. His eyes were pale and cloudy with age, but they held a sharp intelligence. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, bowing first to Corvin, then to Isolde. "For a generation, we have watched the Draen fury consume our kings. We have lived in fear of the day our king would become our greatest enemy." He looked at Isolde, his gaze lingering on the bond at her neck. "The fates have sent us a miracle, a silent spring after a long, brutal winter." He then turned to his attendant, who brought forward a heavy, iron-bound chest. He opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of faded black velvet, was a crown. It was not a glittering thing of gold and jewels. It was a simple, powerful circlet of pale, polished iron, forged to look like two wolves, their bodies entwined, their heads meeting in the procession center. It was an ancient, powerful artifact, the crown of the first northern queens, "This has not been worn in 500 years," the old lord said, his voice filled with reverence. "Not since the last queen who was said to be a true soul bond to her king. It is said it can only be worn by one who rules not through blood or conquest, but through the heart of the kingdom itself." He lifted the crown from the chest. The entire hall fell silent, every eye fixed on the dais. This was more than a gift. It was an acclamation. It was the North, in its own grim, stoic way, choosing its queen. Corvin looked down at Isolde, his amber eyes searching her face. He was not giving her an order. He was asking a question. This was her choice. To accept this crown was to accept her place here, to bind herself to the North and its Wolf King forever. To refuse was to remain his anchor, a tool, but never a partner. She thought of her life in Silverwood, a ghost in the shadows, her worth measured only by what she lacked. She thought of Rhys's easy betrayal, of a world where she had been nothing. Here, in this harsh and unforgiving land, she had found a purpose. She had found a man who, for all his violence and his demons, saw her not for what she couldn't do, but for what only she could. He did not need her voice. He needed her silence. He needed her. Slowly, deliberately, Isolde nodded. A collective sigh of relief and approval went through the hall. Corvin took the crown from the old lord. The iron was cold and heavy in his scarred hands. He turned to her, and in the flickering torchlight, she saw a raw, unguarded emotion in his eye. Gratitude, and something deeper, something that looked almost like hope. He knelt before the throne. The Wolf King of the North, the most feared man on the continent, knelt before his silent, broken Omega. He gently lifted the crown and placed it on her head. It was heavy, the cold iron a stark reality against her brow. It was not a fairy tale coronet. It was a weight, a responsibility, a promise. As the crown settled, the bond at her neck flared, not with pain or rage, but with a brilliant, pure, white light. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat, in time with her own, the two rhythms finally, perfectly, in sync. The two wolves on the crown seemed to shimmer, their iron forms coming alive. He rose to his feet and stood beside her, their alliance now sealed and witnessed by all. She was no longer Isolde Renard, the curse-born. She was the Queen of the North, her crown forged not of gold, but of the silence that had saved a king. 5 winters had passed since the iron crown had settled on Isolde's brow. The snows had come and gone, each season carving deeper lines of character into the land and its people. Drainkeep was no longer a place of echoing silence and fear. The black granite walls still stood, stark and unyielding, but now they held a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of peace, of stability, a silence born not of dread, but of strength. Isolde stood on the high battlements, a place she now thought of as her own. The wind, still sharp with the promise of more snow, whipped strands of her dark hair across her face and billowed the heavy, fur-lined cloak around her. It was a cloak of pure white wolf fur, a gift from the Silvermane clan, and against the black stone of the keep, she was a beacon. She was no longer the frightened, threadbare girl who had arrived as a spoil of war. The years had given her a quiet confidence that radiated from her more powerfully than any spoken word. Her eyes, which had once held only fear and shame, now held the vast, clear depth of the northern sky. She was a queen. Below in the courtyard, the sounds were of life, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of young guards at practice, the laughter of children, including a small, dark-haired boy with one startlingly golden eye who was chasing a large, patient hound. Forlak's son Kyle, no longer a hostage but now a trusted page, watched over the boy with a fierce, protective loyalty. A heavy arm wrapped around her waist, and a familiar, solid warmth pressed against her back. She didn't need to turn. The scent of pine and cold steel, the steady, calm rhythm of his heart, that she felt as much through the bond as through his touch, was as much a part of her as her own breath. "He has your stubbornness," Corvin rumbled, his chin resting on the top of her head. He was watching their son, a rare, soft smile touching the corner of his mouth. Isolde leaned back against him, her hand covering his where it rested on her stomach. She placed her other hand on the slight, firm swell of her belly, where their second child was growing. The elders of Silverwood had called her barren, another mark of her curse. They had been wrong about everything. The bond between them was a placid, deep ocean now. The storms still came, for the fury was a part of his blood, a legacy he would carry to his grave. But they were small squalls now, easily weathered. Her presence, her touch, Her very existence was the anchor that held him fast. He no longer fought the beast within. He had learned, with her, to command it. The Wolf King was a master of his own soul, and his kingdom had prospered under his just and steady rule. He turned her in his arms, his scarred face softening as he looked down at her. The blind eye was a silvered moon, the good one a warm, amber sun. He saw everything in her silent gaze, her love, her strength, her unwavering belief in him. "A delegation arrived this morning," he said, his voice quiet. "From the south, from Silverwood." Isolde's heart gave a single, hard thud. Silverwood. A name from another lifetime. A ghost she had long since buried. She had not thought of them in years. "Alpha Valerius is dead," Corvin continued, watching her reaction carefully. "His pack is failing. The Stonefall Alliance has crumbled. Rhys leads them. Now, he begs an audience. He asks for aid." Rhys, her former mate. The boy who had chosen ambition over fate, who had cast her aside like a broken toy. The phantom ache of that severed bond was long, long gone, replaced by the profound, living connection she shared with Corvin. She felt nothing for Rhys now, but a distant, detached pity. He was a memory, faded and powerless. She looked into Corvin's eyes, and he saw the question there. "What did you tell him?" "I told him," Corvin said, a low growl of possessiveness in his voice, "that the North has but one queen, and her gaze does not turn southward." He had answered for her, not because he sought to control her, but because he knew her heart as well as his own. Her life was here, her pack, her family, her home. She had been born in the gentle lands of the South, but her soul had been forged in the unforgiving winter of the North. She reached up, her fingers tracing the old, silver scar that cut across his eye. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a silent language they had perfected over the years. Her touch no longer risked unleashing a storm. It promised peace. "You are my home," the gesture said. "This is where I belong." He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was as fierce and tender as the man himself. It spoke of gratitude, of a love that had grown not in the light of pretty words and easy promises, but in the shared darkness of their pasts. It was a love built on the foundation of scars, cemented by a bond the world had never seen before. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his good eye closing in contentment. "The bards have given you a name, you know," he murmured, his breath a warm cloud in the cold air. "They don't call you the Silent Queen anymore." She looked at him, her brow furrowed in a silent question. "They call you the North Star Queen," he said, his voice thick with pride, "because you are the one fixed point in my sky, the one who guides me home." She smiled, a true, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. She looked out over the vast, snow-covered lands that were her own, her son's laughter rising up from the courtyard below, the man she loved holding her, and a new life stirring within her. She had been the rejected Omega, the curse-born, the broken thing. But fate, in its infinite and brutal wisdom, had known the truth. Her silence had never been a curse. It had been a crown, waiting for the right king to place it on her head. And here, at the frozen top of the world, she was finally, completely, home.